When we see a majestic medieval castle perched on a hill, with its mighty towers, impregnable walls, and narrow loopholes, it seems to us something eternal, almost natural, as if it grew out of the earth itself. It is a symbol of power, romance, and the bygone era of knights and kings. We admire its architecture. Imagine the feasts in the Great Hall and the sieges it has withstood. For us, the castle is the result, a legend set in stone. But have you ever wondered at what cost these stone giants were built? What really happened at the foot of these walls over the decades they were built? This is not a story of magic or miracles. This is a story of sweat, blood, incredible human ingenuity, and monstrous sacrifice. It is a story of how thousands of people, with nothing but their hands, primitive tools, and willpower, created the most complex and durable structures of their era. The question remains, would we today, with our technology and knowledge, be able to repeat this feat if we were deprived of cranes, bulldozers, and computers? The answer lies in 10 surprising and often shocking facts about medieval construction that will change your mind about how these stone monsters were built. In our time, the construction of a skyscraper begins with thousands of pages of drawings created by entire architectural bureaus with the help of the most sophisticated computer programs. In the Middle Ages, the entire project of a giant castle, from the foundation to the teeth on the towers, often existed only in the head of one man, Master Mason. This man was not just a foreman, he was an architect, engineer, logistician, and project manager in one person. His authority on the construction site was unquestionable, and his knowledge was almost sacred. The Master Mason was the elite of the construction world. He received no formal education at a university. His knowledge was the result of decades of practical experience passed on from master to apprentice. He started as a simple journeyman, carrying stones, and slowly, year after year, learned the secrets of the craft. He could read the landscape, determine the best place for a wall, calculate the load on an arch, and design ingenious spiral staircases twisted clockwise so that the attacker, usually right-handed, was uncomfortable with his sword and the defender was comfortable. He knew which stone was suitable for foundations and which for fine carvings. This knowledge was intuitive, based on hundreds of trial and error by his predecessors. He had no detailed blueprints. His main tools were simple but ingenious devices based on practical geometry. The angle for right angles, the circles for arches and circles, and the plumb line for checking the verticality of walls. With these, he could mark out a life-size plan of the future castle directly on the ground, using pegs and ropes. For more complex elements, such as the nervures of Gothic vaults or the tracery of windows, he used a tracing floor, a large, smooth plaster floor in his workshop lodge. Here on his knees, he drew out templates in actual size, which were then transferred to thin boards for use by the master stonemasons. The master stonemason was an itinerant specialist. Great craftsmen such as the famous Master James of St. George, the Savoyard genius who built a chain of castles in Wales, including Carnarvon and Harlech, for King Edward the Fern, were international stars. Kings and dukes poached them from each other, offering huge sums of money for the time. A master stonemason's salary could exceed that of a knight. He was rewarded with land, houses, and expensive clothes. But he didn't sit in an office. He was constantly on the construction site, personally supervising every stage, from the laying of the foundation to the setting of the last stone. He had to manage hundreds and sometimes thousands of workers, resolve disputes, keep track of supplies and budgets. He was solely responsible for the outcome. A miscalculation could have led to the collapse of the tower and his own demise, both physical and professional. This system, based not on formal calculations, but on experience and a deep, almost mystical understanding of the properties of stone, made it possible to create incredibly complex and durable structures. The castle was not just a set of walls and towers, it was the embodiment of the vision and will of a single genius, whose name often remained in the shadow of the name of his powerful client. We admire the height of castle walls and the elegance of towers, but we do not see what is hidden underground. But it was there, in the darkness and mud, that the fate of the entire structure was decided as a result of titanic labor. Medieval craftsmen knew that a castle is only as strong as its foundation, and it took years of hard, thankless, and dangerous labor to prepare this foundation. The first thing to do was to choose the right place. A rocky cliff was ideal. The rock itself served as an excellent foundation and natural defense. But if the castle was built on the plain, a real battle with the ground began. First, a huge ditch was dug. This was done by hand, by thousands of people using primitive picks, wooden shovels with iron tips and wicker baskets in which the earth was carried out. Building a large castle required moving millions of cubic meters of earth. The ditch could be 10-15 meters deep and 20-30 meters wide. The excavated earth was not wasted. It was used to build a massive rampart on the inner side of the moat, creating an additional obstacle. If the landscape allowed, the moat was filled with water from the nearest river, turning the castle into an impregnable island. Then the foundations for the walls were laid. For this purpose, wide trenches were dug until they reached solid ground or rocky base. The depth of the foundation could be enormous, sometimes comparable to the height of the visible part of the wall. This work was deadly dangerous. Trench walls constantly crumbled, burying diggers alive. Groundwater filled the trench, and workers had to stand knee-deep in cold mud, scooping out water with leather buckets. The bottom of the trench was carefully tamped and sometimes reinforced by driving hundreds of oak piles into the ground, especially if the ground was swampy. These piles, being in a humid environment without access to oxygen, did not rot and could serve as a support for centuries. Only after that the masonry began. The bottom rows of the foundation were made of the largest and roughest stones, which were not suitable for walls. They were laid on a layer of rubble and poured with liquid lime mortar, which when hardened, turned the foundation into a monolith. Often, stone from ditch digging was used as a foundation material. It was a waste-free technology. A deep and strong foundation was important not only for stability, but also for defense. The main threat during a siege was undermining or sapa. The besiegers would dig a tunnel under the wall, reinforce it with wooden stanchions, and then set them on fire. The collapse of the tunnel led to the collapse of the wall. The deep foundations going into the rock made this tactic almost impossible. This stage also laid the foundation for all the secret passages, cellars, dungeons, and rainwater harvesting cisterns. All this titanic work was hidden from view, but it was what ensured the stability of the stone giants. A mistake at this stage, incorrect assessment of the soil, insufficient depth of the foundation, was fatal and could not be corrected. The majestic walls built on weak foundations would eventually crack and collapse. That's why master stonemasons treated the laying of the foundation with an almost religious awe. The construction of the castle was one of the largest and most complex projects of its time, requiring the mobilization of enormous human resources. Thousands of people could work on the construction site simultaneously, forming a complex hierarchical pyramid from unskilled and disenfranchised laborers to highly paid and respected craftsmen. The backbone of this army, its muscle power, was made up of peasants driven to the construction site as part of feudal indentured servitude, or corvée. Each peasant living on a lord's land was obliged to work for his lord a certain number of days a year for free, and building a castle was one of the heaviest of these duties. These men were used on the dirtiest, hardest, and most dangerous jobs, digging ditches and trenches, carrying earth and stones, bringing water and mortar, working inside the great wheel of the crane. They had no skills or desire, but they also had no choice. Refusal to work was punished severely. For large royal projects, such as castles in Wales, direct forced recruitment was also used. Royal agents had the power to forcibly requisition thousands of workers from all over the country and drive them to the site. Above them were skilled laborers and artisans who were hired for wages. Their hierarchy and pay were strictly regulated. Career laborers, quarriers. They worked in quarries, sometimes tens of kilometers away from the construction site. Their job was to extract stone by chipping huge blocks of rock with iron wedges, hammers, and levers. It was hard and dangerous work. Stone cutters, masons. These were the elite of the construction site. They were divided into rough masons, who built walls of rough stone, and freemasons, or freemasons. Freemasons worked with soft, easily workable stone, free stone, such as limestone, and created all the complex architectural elements. Arches, vaults, window openings, and decorative carvings. Their labor was highly valued. Carpenters, their role was no less important. They built all wooden structures, complex and dangerous scaffolding, cranes, roof trusses, floors, doors, and interior finishes. Blacksmiths, smiths, they created all the metal parts, forging thousands of nails, door hinges, window bars, gate shackles, and most importantly, constantly mending and sharpening tools for the masons. The forge at the construction site worked nonstop. There were also other specialists: lime kilns, roofers, who roofed the roofs with lead, tiles, or slate, glaziers, plumbers, who laid lead pipes for water supply and sewage disposal. All this army lived here, at the foot of the castle under construction, in temporary wooden barracks and mud huts. For a few years or decades, a whole construction town would emerge here with its own turbulent life, with a market, beer halls, prostitutes, a priest, and constant conflicts. It was a melting pot where people from all over the country and even abroad met, bringing with them their languages, customs, and diseases. Building a castle is first and foremost about logistics. An average castle required hundreds of thousands of tons of materials: stone, wood, lime, sand, iron, lead. To get all this to a construction site, often located on a high hill or cliff, without modern technology, was a task of incredible complexity, a real logistical nightmare requiring ingenious organization and inhuman labor. The main building material was stone. The ideal was to have a quarry right on the construction site. If there was no quarry, the stone had to be transported, sometimes tens of kilometers away. The most primitive but effective means were used for this purpose. Stone blocks were loaded on oxen sleds. The oxen were preferable to horses. They were stronger, more resilient, and could haul heavy loads over poor, washed-out roads that were a muddy mess most of the year. One sled could carry no more than 1 or 2 large blocks. One can only imagine the endless caravans of wagons slowly creeping toward the construction site, the squeaking wheels, the screams of the drivers, and the constant breakdowns. Repairing the wagons and caring for the draft animals was a separate, critical task. If there was a navigable river nearby, it was a great fortune. Water transportation was the cheapest and most efficient way to transport heavy loads. Stone was loaded onto flat-bottom barges and floated down the river as close to the construction site as possible. It was then reloaded back onto wagons. For example, the famous stone from Caen, France, was transported to England for the construction of the tower and other prestigious buildings by sea. It was a complex international operation. Wood also required transportation. Huge oak trunks for beams and rafters were cut from nearby forests and dragged to the site using the same oxen. In winter, this task was simplified. It was easier to drag the logs over frozen ground or snow on special sledges. The most difficult thing was to get the materials to the construction site itself, especially if it was on top of a hill. For this purpose, special wooden ramps were built, or a system of blocks and winches driven by human or animal power was used. The lime needed for the mortar was also the product of a complex production cycle. Limestone was quarried, then it had to be fired. To do this, lime kilns were built. Large stone structures that looked like a truncated cone. Limestone and fuel, wood or coal, were loaded into the kiln in layers and kept at a high temperature for several days. The result was quicklime, which was then quenched with water to produce a powder ready to be mixed with sand. These kilns were located as close to the construction site as possible, so that the fragile burnt material would not have to be transported. This complex system was managed by a special official, the clerk of the works. This was often a clergyman, one of the few literate people. He was the bookkeeper, supply manager, and treasurer of the project. He kept a record of every cartload of stone, every sack of lime, every coin paid out. His parchment scrolls were the think tank of the entire operation. Hundreds of men were busy doing nothing more than ensuring the construction site's supply ran smoothly. Any disruption, a washed-out road, a broken wagon, a shallowed river, a carter's strike, could bring the entire construction to a halt. Scaffolding was needed to build walls to great heights, but forget about modern steel, modular structures with secure fastenings and railings. Medieval scaffolds were temporary, rickety and deadly structures made of wood and ropes that wrapped around the castle under construction like a spider's web. Working on them was a daily test of courage, luck, and sense of balance. The scaffolding was built by carpenters. They consisted of vertical posts and horizontal beams made of long poles, often pine or spruce. These poles were tied together with ropes made of hemp or bald hemp. Nails were rarely used because iron was expensive and would be difficult to remove once the scaffolding was dismantled. The rope knots were soaked and stretched by the weather and had to be constantly checked and tightened. The whole structure creaked and swayed in the wind, living its own frightening life. The scaffolding structure was integrated into the wall itself. During the masonry process, the masons left special square holes in the wall. Putt-log holes. The ends of horizontal beams were inserted into these holes, on which wooden planking was then laid. This was the main working platform. It was narrow, uneven, and could barely fit 2 people on it. There were, of course, no handrails or safety nets. The only support was the wall itself. As the wall grew, the scaffolding was built up by moving the beams higher and higher. Climbing these scaffolds was an acrobatic stunt in itself. Workers climbed up vertical poles or rickety ladders, risking falling off the enormous height. Working on such a structure was incredibly dangerous. A strong gust of wind could swing the entire structure and throw a person down. A rotted beam could break under the weight of a stone or a worker. Decking wet from rain became as slippery as ice. Falls from scaffolding were one of the most common causes of death on a construction site. One wrong step, one moment of vertigo, was enough to fly down from a height of 10, 20, or 30 meters. Despite the danger, life was boiling on these scaffolds. Stonemasons were laying stones. Workers were hauling mortar and small stones on their backs or with simple hand winches. All this took place at dizzying heights, in wind, rain, or scorching sun. This daily work required not only skill, but also nerves of iron and a complete lack of fear of heights. The psychological strain was enormous. Every day the worker looked into the face of death. After the castle construction was finished, the scaffolding was dismantled and the finger nests in the walls were either covered with stone or left. In many castles, they can still be seen today as mute scars, evidence of the dangerous technology that allowed them to come into existence. How do you lift a stone block weighing several hundred kilograms or a huge oak beam to the top of a wall under construction? For this purpose, medieval builders used powerful lifting mechanisms, the pinnacle of engineering thought of that time. But the main driving force behind these mechanisms was not steam or electrical energy, but raw human muscle power turned into effective lifting power. The most impressive of these devices was a large treadwheel crane. It was a large wooden boom mounted on a turntable, which allowed the load to be moved not only upwards, but also sideways. But its main element was a huge wooden wheel, similar to a hamster wheel, up to 4 or 5 meters in diameter. Inside this wheel, stepping over the wooden rungs, as on an endless ladder, walked 1 or 2 people. Their walking rotated the wheel, which in turn, through a system of axes, wound a rope with a load tied to it onto a drum. The physics of this device was ingenious. The large diameter of the wheel created a huge lever, allowing the force of 2 men to lift a weight that they would not have been able to with an ordinary gate. It was an ingenious yet hellish machine. The men inside the wheel were the living engine. They were most likely the strongest but unskilled laborers. They went hour after hour in semi-darkness, inside the creaking wooden mechanism, lifting multi-ton blocks blindly. The work was monotonous, exhausting, and dangerous. One wrong move, a broken axle or a broken rope, and the whole system could go wrong, crippling or killing the runners. There were other simpler lifting mechanisms. A windlass was a horizontal drum with 2 handles that was turned by 2 men. A capstan was a vertical drum with long levers that was pushed in a circle by several men. These devices made it possible to lift less heavy loads, buckets of mortar, small stones, tools. All these machines were made entirely of wood by carpenters right on the construction site. The ropes were woven from hemp. They were strong, but over time they frayed from friction and moisture, which was another source of constant danger. The crane was operated by a separate foreman who used gestures and shouts to coordinate the actions of the runners in the wheel. the workers on the ground clinging to the load, and the masons above ready to receive it. It was a complex precision ballet where a mistake cost lives. The use of these human engines allowed construction at astonishing speed. For example, when building castles in Wales, workers using such cranes could lay up to 400 cubic meters of masonry a day. But behind this efficiency was the inhuman labor of nameless workers, who, like squirrels in a wheel, with their sweat and strength set in motion all this gigantic construction machine. The stone walls of the castle are not just stones stacked on top of each other. Their strength and durability depended on the glue that held them together: mortar. The production of quality mortar in the Middle Ages was a real alchemy, a complicated, dirty, and dangerous process that required special knowledge, and the fate of the entire castle depended on its recipe. The main components of the mortar were lime, sand, and water, but the devil, as always, was in the details. The quality of each component was crucial. The sand had to be pure, free of clay and organic impurities. It was washed and sifted. The water also had to be pure, but the main and most difficult component was lime. It was obtained by burning limestone or chalk in special kilns at a temperature of about 900 degrees Celsius. A lime kiln was a large stone tower or pit that was continuously heated with wood or coal for several days. The kiln workers had to keep the fire burning day and night, being in the midst of hellish heat and acrid smoke. This process converted calcium carbonate into calcium oxide, or quicklime. This quicklime was then quenched by carefully adding water. The reaction was violent and dangerous, generating large amounts of heat and steam. Adding water too quickly could lead to a steam explosion. The resulting powder or paste of quicklime was often kept in special pits, covered with sand for months, sometimes years. It was believed that ripened lime gave a better and more plastic mortar. Mixing mortar was hard physical work. Workers in large wooden boxes or directly on the ground mixed lime and sand in the right proportion, usually 1.3, and then added water, mixing it all with wooden hose until a homogeneous mass was obtained. Working with lime was unhealthy. It was corrosive, corroding the skin, and lime dust was harmful to the lungs. But medieval craftsmen often added other, sometimes unexpected ingredients to the mortar to improve its properties. Archaeologists have found crushed bricks or roof tiles in medieval mortar to improve its hydraulic properties, its ability to harden when wet. Most surprising, however, were the organic additives. Animal fat, milk, cottage cheese, egg whites, or even ox blood could be added to make the mortar more malleable and stronger. The proteins and casein in these products reacted with the lime to form complex polymer compounds that worked as a primitive plasticizer, making the mortar less brittle. These secret ingredients were part of every master stonemason's know-how. This mortar was used to bond the treated stones on the outer and inner surfaces of the wall, and the huge space between them was filled with so-called zabutovka, a mixture of liquid mortar and any available construction debris, untreated stones, rubble. As a result, the wall turned into a monolith, a kind of medieval concrete. The quality of the mortar was so important that walls built in the Roman era using high-quality mortar with volcanic ash were often stronger than medieval masonry. But the best examples of medieval mortar, created using this complex alchemical recipe, hardened into a stone-like monolith that still stands today. At the center of the entire gigantic construction site stood a special caste of people, masons. They were not just laborers, but highly skilled, respected, and often wealthy craftsmen who possessed secret knowledge passed down from generation to generation. They were a true brotherhood with their own rules, hierarchy, secrets, and even secret signs that distinguished them from all other artisans. The masons were divided into several categories. At the bottom of the hierarchy were quarrymen, and rough masons. The former quarried stone, the latter laid walls of roughly worked blocks, mainly engaged in filling the inner space of the wall. It was hard but relatively simple work. The real elite were the Freemasons, or Freemasons. The name comes not from the secret society, but from the material they worked with. Free stone, a soft stone, limestone, or sandstone that could be cut in any direction. Freemasons were sculptors and stone artists. They carved intricate architectural details, open-work window patterns, capstones for arches, capitals for columns, and nervures for Gothic vaults. Their work required not only strength, but also incredible precision, artistic taste, and knowledge of practical geometry. They worked not on the wall under the blazing sun, but in their indoor workshop lodge, creating details according to the master mason's templates. The path to this fraternity was a long one. A boy was apprenticed to a master for 7 years. He started with the simplest of tasks, carrying tools, preparing clay for models, cleaning the workshop. He lived with his master and received food and shelter in exchange for his labor. For years, he watched and repeated, learning the secrets of the craft. Only after completing his apprenticeship did he become a journeyman and could work for wages. Stonemasons were itinerant artisans. After completing one project, they would pack up their precious tools, hammers, mallets, a set of chisels and circulars, and move on to another construction site, often in another city or even another country. This mobility and corporate insularity gave rise to its own secrets. One of the most interesting are the mason's marks. Mason's marks. Each skilled mason had a personal, unique mark, a simple geometric figure that he carved into the stones he worked. These marks served several purposes. First, it was a signature, a way of marking his work. Second, it was a system of quality control. The master stonemason could see who had made a particular block. Third, it was a system of record-keeping for labor payment, as masons were often paid by the number of stones they worked. Today, thousands of these unique marks can be found on the walls of medieval castles and cathedrals, like the personal autographs of nameless geniuses. This system of signs, as well as the closed nature of their lodges, where the professional secrets of geometry and initiation rituals were kept, became the prototype of future Masonic societies. But at its core, it was a professional fraternity, united by pride in their craft and a common cause: the transformation of formless stone into eternal masterpieces of architecture. The construction site of a medieval castle was one of the most dangerous places to work imaginable. Safety techniques as we know them did not exist. Death and injury were a daily routine, a cost of production that was taken for granted. The life of an ordinary worker was not valued highly, and project deadlines and budgets were paramount. Every day when a worker went to the construction site, he risked not coming home. Danger lurked at every turn, starting with the quarry. Extracting stone with wedges and hammers was an unpredictable process. A hidden crack in the rock could cause a multi-ton block to collapse, burying workers underneath. The dust from the rock clogged the lungs, leading to silicosis. Falls from heights were the most common cause of death on the construction site itself. Shaky rope-bound scaffolding, narrow slippery decks, and the absence of any guardrails or insurance made working at height deadly. One wrong step, a gust of wind, a broken beam, and a man flew down from a height of dozens of meters onto sharp stones and construction debris. Collapses and falling objects were the second most frequent cause of tragedies. A rope break on a crane could cause a stone block to fall on the heads of workers below. An improperly installed strut in a foundation trench could cause a ground collapse that buried excavators alive. Tools, stones, buckets of mortar all fell from the scaffolding constantly, maiming and killing those at the foot of the wall. There were no helmets, of course. Injuries from tools and materials were ubiquitous. Sharp axes and chisels, heavy hammers, rough stones with sharp edges were the source of constant cuts, bruises, and fractures. A simple wound in the unsanitary conditions of a construction site, where dirt and manure were everywhere, could easily become infected, leading to gangrene, tetanus, and death. Diseases associated with overcrowding and poor living conditions in the temporary work camps also claimed many lives. Thousands of people packed into one place lived in unsanitary barracks. Lack of clean water and sanitation led to outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and other infectious diseases that spread with lightning speed. Medical care was rudimentary. There might be a barber surgeon on a construction site who could set a simple fracture, often incorrectly resulting in a lifelong limp, or amputate a shattered limb without anesthesia by cauterizing the wound with a red-hot iron. The chances of survival after such surgery were slim. We have documented evidence of the level of danger. For example, the construction record books of Westminster Abbey record regular payments of compensation to the families of workers killed or maimed. These scanty entries, to John for a broken leg, 2 shillings, to the widow of William killed by a fallen stone, 5 shillings, are chilling testimony to the price ordinary people paid for the construction of these architectural masterpieces. Death was so commonplace that work stopped only long enough to remove the body. Erecting a large stone castle was an incredibly expensive and time-consuming endeavor. It was not just a building project, but a major magnum opus in the life of any powerful lord or king, requiring enormous financial investment and taking decades and sometimes generations to complete. The castle was a devourer of money, time, and human lives, and the decision to build it was one of the riskiest a ruler could make. The cost of construction was astronomical. It was made up of many factors. The biggest cost was labor. Although some of the unskilled work was done by peasants as part of the barshchuna, they had to be fed. And an army of hundreds of skilled artisans, masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, had to be hired at a daily wage for many years. Materials also cost a fortune. Stone, if it had to be brought from far away, was expensive because of transportation. Iron for tools, nails, and gate shackles was very valuable. Lead for roofs and plumbing was a luxury, and glass for windows was so expensive that it could only be afforded in a chapel or in a lord's private chambers. To understand the scale, let's turn to the numbers. The construction of Carnarvon Castle in Wales by King Edward I at the end of the 13th century cost the crown a mind-boggling sum of about £27,000 sterling. The annual income of the entire English kingdom at that time was about £30,000. That is, one castle was worth almost the annual budget of an entire country, and Edward was building a whole chain of such castles. To finance such projects, kings and lords went to extreme lengths, imposing new, heavy taxes that caused discontent and rebellions, taking huge loans from Italian bankers, such as Riccardi of Lucca, falling into debt, confiscating the property of their enemies. Often the construction of a castle brought its owner to the brink of bankruptcy. Sometimes the money ran out, and the construction stopped for years or decades, turning into a long construction. Many castles were never completed according to the original plan. Time was also an important factor. Construction took place mostly during the warm season, from spring to fall. In winter, work involving mortar ceased as it would not set in the cold. A small Motte and Bailey-type castle could be erected in a few months, but building a stone giant was the work of a lifetime. A small stone castle could be built in 5 to 10 years, but the erection of such complexes as Dover Castle or Edward I's castles stretched for 20, 30 or more years. Often the lord who started the construction did not live to finish it, and the work was continued by his heirs. They built not for themselves but for their dynasty, thinking in terms of generations, not years. Moreover, a lord could not just start building. He had to get official permission from the king, a license to crenellate. This was not just a formal document, but an instrument of political control. The king gave such permission only to those lords in whose loyalty he was sure. Building a castle without a license was considered an act of rebellion, and the king could order the illegal construction demolished. This incredible duration and cost meant that the castle was more than just a military fortress. It was a major symbol of status, power, and legitimacy. To build a stone castle was to make a statement to the world about one's power and wealth. It was a materialization of power, a message to rivals and subjects. The jagged walls and high towers were meant not only to protect, but also to inspire awe and reverence. They were an eternal monument to the dynasty that would stand for centuries, glorifying the name of its creator. And for the sake of this, the lords were ready to spend entire fortunes and lives, leaving behind not just a fortress, but a stone saga of their power. The erection of a medieval English castle was a marvel of organization, engineering, and human endurance. Behind the majestic stone facades we admire today lies a story of Herculean effort, inhuman labor, and countless sacrifices. It was not the work of kings and knights in shining armor. It was the work of thousands of nameless peasants, stonemasons, carpenters, and laborers who with their strength, sweat, and blood turned the will of one man into eternal stone. A castle is not just a building, it is a monument to an entire era, its technology, its social structure, its fears and ambitions. It was born out of the genius of a master stonemason, the absolute power of a lord, and the muscle power of the people. It required logistics comparable to a military campaign and was built at a risk to life that seems unthinkable to us today. Every stone within its walls is a story of hard work, of danger, and of man's incredible ability to create something grand, even with almost nothing more than the simplest of tools and an indomitable will. If this dive into the harsh but amazing reality of medieval construction was exciting for you, and you want to learn more about how people actually lived, struggled, and created in the past, give us a like and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Together we will continue to destroy historical myths and discover the real, authentic past. Don't miss new videos. There are many more amazing stories ahead of you.